Hi all, this is Catherine. This is my week 3 presentation. This week we were presenting about case studies, and the case study that I chose was proprietary software in an emergency. A little bit of background about this case study. This case study involves the GIS Corps, which is a nonprofit organization which coordinates volunteer GIS services to underprivileged communities. This often comes in the form of relief, especially for things like natural disasters. The volunteers of the GIS Corps are screened and required to follow ERISA's Code of Conduct Ethics, including the kind of 4 most important points, which are remaining software neutral, seeking the most appropriate and sustainable technology and solution for the community in need, make recommendations without exploitation or regard for personal or agency profit, and to refrain from accepting software donations. These are all kind of going to be important points of the Code of Ethics that are that will affect today's case study. So the case study situation. There was a tsunami that hit and destroyed a large coastal area of a developing country. There are GIS volunteers there to help support damage assessment and provide support for critical search and rescue operations by local authorities. The GIS Corps has volunteers there, but it's not just them. There's a variety of other volunteers and other organizations. There was a GIS software company that donated a license of its product for use in the emergency, specifically donating them directly to the local authorities. The case study states that the number of volunteers and local residents is much greater than the number of available software licenses. Time is of the essence, as many people will die from a lack of fresh water, etc., if rescue crews are not able to find the best routes to them around destroyed buildings and debris carried inshore by tsunami waves. The problem is that a GISP found out that some of the volunteers are using bootlegged copies of the software. And that's the kind of big ethical problem. So step 1 is to state the problem. So the first and most obvious problem is the GISP now knows and is comfortable about the other volunteers using the bootleg copies of the software. It is illegal, and so it is against the law because it's not a legal copy of the software. It is against the Code of Ethics of the GISP and the GIS Corps organization. There is also a couple other kind of ethical issues that aren't kind of directly kind of obvious. Problem 2 is that these are time-sensitive rescue efforts with people's lives on the line. This is a major problem. And if you, in this kind of context, if you choose to do something that would hinder that, you could be responsible for people not getting the rescue that they need. Problem 3 is that there are different codes of ethics from different organizations. And could this hurt the cooperation between everyone? Bringing up this possible breach of ethics in, your eyes, would that lead to, 1, a shift of resources to now look at this ethics problem away from the rescue efforts? And 2, could this hinder the cooperation between all the volunteers that have come there to help? So step 2 would be checking the facts. The first thing that I can't actually check in this case study but would is, are the software copies actually bootlegged versions? So confirming that what you think are bootleg versions are actually bootleg versions. Where did the GISP hear this and what evidence do they have of that? I would also want to check the facts surrounding, how many volunteers do we have? What are these volunteers all doing? Is everybody have a necessary role? Are all the roles filled? Are there people that don't need to be somewhere that could be moved somewhere else? All of these the situational kind of facts need to be clearly laid out. And then the other thing is facts. This is the GIS Corps' code of conduct. remaining software neutral, seeking the most appropriate and sustainable technology and solution for the community need, making recommendations without exploitation or regard for personal or agency profit, and refraining from accepting software donations. And so these are the kind of the main points, the facts of this code of ethics. So step 3 of this process is identifying the relevant factors. There's a variety of numerous kind of relevant factors in this case. The first of all being that there are volunteers of multiple organizations here. It's not just the GIS Corps. And therefore there's multiple different codes of ethics and codes of conduct. In addition, there's different various levels of software access. Depending on what volunteer kind of organization you're associated with, or if you're on your own, if you're working with local authorities, there's different kind of levels of access of what you have, what is being provided to you, and your resources. Another relevant factor is that the donation of software was made to the local authorities, and the local authorities accepted and handed out those licenses. And so all of that was done under somebody else's umbrella. Another thing is, who exactly did the local authorities give licenses to? Were they other volunteers of other kind of organizations? Because it sounds like the GIS Corps mainly has a lot of their kind of software situated. The other factor is that there is a very narrow window for rescue efforts. There's a rescue effort timeline that needs to be kept in mind at all stages. There is not time for lots of dithering or discussion about this. Another thing is the available mapping software. This is in a developing country and somewhere that was just hit by a natural disaster. There's probably going to be a lack of power and electricity places. There might even be a lack of places to set up. I highly doubt there's going to be much internet, if any, at least definitely at first. And so what resources are you going to have there? Because some available mapping software might require the use of the internet to share data. Especially things like ArcGIS Online and the databases. And then the final thing is a reminder of the code of ethics for other volunteers. What were their codes that they had to sign, or are they a part of, and how does that align or differ with the GIS Corps? So step 4 is to develop a list of options. So option A is to speak to the organization or the person in charge of the volunteers who have these bootleg copies. You would report the problem so that somebody who is managing them is aware, and you can ask to either get them relicenses, however the manager or overseer of that organization will do that, or to remove them from that aspect of the project. Option B would be to suggest using open source software. If you don't need a license, then there won't be any problems with illegal kind of copies of it. Option C is to have the local authorities ask the company for additional emergency licenses. While the GIS Corps is against asking for donations or accepting donations, the local authorities are not. And it doesn't sound like the volunteers who are using them are members of the GIS Corps. So this could kind of get around that problem. I think it would be a little bit sticky, maybe in personal ethics, but we'll get to that. Option D would be to move these volunteers to other related mapping tasks, such as tracking down data, managing databases, taking and organizing intake data. There are other roles for GIS volunteers to play other than specifically manipulating the data in a software program. You need reliable data to even start to work with of the area. You need somebody to manage all of the files that are kind of being brought together. You need somebody who is taking the data, from reports of, people who are still stranded places, or about places who are setting up, the soup kitchen over here or a safe zone over here. So there are other roles. And then option E would be to just ignore the problem and do nothing. So testing these options. The article went into kind of a great length about the different kind of people and viewpoints to kind of test these options against. If I did that for every single one of my options, we would be here forever. So I'm going to do a little bit more of an overview. So for option A, first you have to be able to find the manager or somebody who is overseeing these volunteers. But once you do, reporting should be fairly simple. That should cover your responsibility as a GISP and kind of your responsibility to finding out this problem. You cannot make them take action or follow your code of ethics. You could then report them to the law. However, I don't foresee the local authorities doing anything about this at this time. The other thing is that this may still not fulfill, the GISP's sense of ethics about the situation. Option B would be to use an open source software like QGIS. That would get around the problem of having a software license, so that would take care of the legal-illegal problem. It would also satisfy the GISP's kind of code of ethics of kind of not accepting software donations and not using illegal copies. However, it would require the volunteers to switch what program they're using. This would require time to kind of migrate the data, depending on what they're using. If they already have databases set up and if they are working with other people within that system, they may have to disconnect from it, set up a new one. They may have to, transform different files. This would take time. This would take time out of the rescue efforts. And this could also ruffle some feathers with the volunteers who, have no issue right now working with what they have. And so you're, basically calling them out and asking them to change all of this in this context. Option C, you need to reach out to the local authorities. You need to have someone who would speak with you and then take the time to reach out to the company that gave the licenses. Then you need time to receive additional temporary licenses if the company decided to give more. And then you need the time and manpower to organize and distribute them. And then the time for those people to actually activate the licenses. This would solve the legal issue, but it would be a very gray area in the GIS Corps' code of ethics. Asking for and accepting donations of software is against the code of ethics, and this kind of asking the local authorities to ask for it is a very gray area workaround. I think most people would kind of agree that it is a breach of ethics. I would point out that somebody would say, well, would the company even give additional temporary licenses? I would argue yes. Simply because they first offered to give temporary licenses for this emergency situation. They could be temporary licenses, so they didn't have to be permanent, and it would be extremely bad PR for the company to refuse to help relief efforts after a natural disaster in a developing country. So option D is about, as I said, there was Hurricane Katrina was the example for this case study. And in this one, one of the volunteers, talks about having clearly defined roles. In particular, assigning someone to track down useful data can make a big difference in the effectiveness of the entire effort. And so this would require kind of speaking to somebody who's overseeing these volunteers. But hopefully there is somebody who is organizing kind of all of these volunteers anyways, because you need to be intaking and kind of the data and giving maps and data back to the relief efforts and the rescue crews. So there should be somebody in that role. This would kind of satisfy the code of ethics, as they wouldn't be going against accepting or using the bootleg versions. It would still be against their accepting donations, but since they weren't the one who did it, I don't think they can really have a problem with that. The only other problem would be that there would need to be roles that are like this that need to be fulfilled. And so they would either need to be picked out or have someone not already in them. And then option E is the kind of the do nothing option. So the question is, what responsibilities does the GISP have, kind of referring to this behavior? Do they have any authority over these volunteers? Is kind of reporting them kind of the limit of what they should be doing? In this situation, is it the time to focus on this problem and to report kind of this breach of ethics and use of illegal software? We're in the middle of a crisis moment with human lives on the line. Is this even the GISP's kind of job to confront and deal with this? I think that in terms of ethics, the GISP would not be happy to have to ignore it since it goes against the code of ethics. But they can't, since they already can't argue against the local authorities accepting these software licenses in this emergency situation, they're already going to have a problem in terms of ethics with the situation flat out. And you can't just ask the local authorities not to use these licenses that are desperately needed, after a tsunami to help with rescue efforts. So there is going to be some uncomfortableness, from the GIS Corps volunteers and this GISP because of that situation to start with. So then you kind of have to ask yourself, in the situation, what's worth it? So kind of taking 6 and 7 together, which is making a choice and reviewing that choice. So the first kind of thing would be to point out that more software licenses are needed and see if the local authorities can get more. The local authorities should have a liaison person, and you can kind of refer to the greater damage that you're finding than initially assessed and how there are human lives at stakes. And as I said, the company would get pretty bad PR if they refused. But there's also the kind of suggesting and assigning other kind of roles. As I mentioned, there's a lot of different tasks that go into this kind of rescue effort. And that would satisfy pretty much all the different parties. The volunteers would still be helping with things. The local authorities would still have their kind of help. The mapping would still continue, even maybe more effectively if they had people tracking down this type of data. And, the GIS Corps ethics code wouldn't be broken in this way. My kind of take on this is that while the situation may be illegal, it is contextually ethical. You are in a situation where you are helping rescue efforts to rescue people who, if you don't get to them in time, will die. In that context, somebody using a bootlegged version of the mapping software is not important or focus. Deal with it after. If one of these solutions can't be quickly implemented, I think that it should just be dropped at that point. Bring it up later, work on it for the next time, bring it up to the leaders as something to kind of work with on a lot wider scale. But, now is not the time to go over that. That at least is my point of view. In one of the readings this week, they had the diagram where they showed how much kind of crossed over between, ethical and legal. And, things could be ethical but illegal, and ethical and legal, or legal but unethical. And there's this very kind of small section that was illegal but ethical. And I think that's what this is kind of in. I do think there are ways to work with it and make it more ethical to the specific code of ethics of the GIS Corps. But once again, if all the volunteers aren't from the GIS Corps, how much can you impose your code of ethics on other volunteers? This then talks about, then you're not reporting them for a breach of ethics, you're reporting them for a breach of law, which is different. So it's a little bit of a sticky situation. I think this one was a little bit easier for me to see a decision about because there were human lives at stake, like imminently at stake within the next couple days. So that made it a little bit simpler to kind of weigh the different options. I hope you guys found this as fascinating as I did, and I look forward to hearing everybody else's.